Okay, Hervé, we're almost ready to go. Okay, so this is the final session, and it's probably the most exciting session, I think, that we've ever put on. We have, well, the two best-known whistleblowers in the world. Joining us from France is Hervé Falciani, the HSBC whistleblower. So,
I know.
Just so you know, Hervé, we've got a room of a couple of hundred people who are quite senior figures involved in international finance, both from the offshore world and the onshore world. So we have a lot of people from the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, and other Caribbean islands, and also Bermuda, and we have many people obviously from the United States, the United Kingdom, and other places. And we also have a lot of journalists who registered for the event, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, Reuters, the Associated Press. We have journalists from Switzerland, Swiss TV, Norway. We have a Hollywood film producer, all of whom registered. And we've also got a panel that includes Brad Birkenfeld, who I'm sure you all know, particularly from yesterday. This is Brad's official speaking engagement. Yesterday was his unofficial speaking engagement. And also, so Brad is on your far right, and then we have his attorney, Dean Zerby. And Dean wrote, or mainly wrote, the US whistleblower law, and then hopped into private practice and took advantage of it very successfully. And then on your far left, we have Gerard Ryle of the ICIJ, and Gerard has been a recipient of many thousands of leaked records, and has been involved in the publication of them and the coordination with journalists all around the world. So in terms of format, I want to kick off with Hervé. And actually, the very first question, well, I'll just provide some background to you, Hervé. I think you're 43 years old.
Correct, yeah.
You grew up in Monaco?
Indeed, yes, among a lot of private banks.
And you're a citizen of France and Italy?
Exactly, yes, both.
And you were
both passports.
And you were a computer systems engineer for the Swiss operation of HSBC from...
Well, not a system engineer, but architect. I mean, software architect, yes.
Okay.
For strategic projects in HSBC, strategic teams.
And that was from about 2001 to 2008, somewhere around there?
Yeah, end of 2008, exactly.
And basically, you collected, acquired confidential data on more than 100,000 of the bank's customers from, I believe, over 100 countries. And there were approximately 300,000 accounts from what I've read. And many of those accounts belonged to sort of wealthy, prominent individuals. Is that right?
Yeah, I started to be, after years working on strategic and sensitive projects for the bank, for the private branch of HSBC Bank, I've been, let's say, exposed to the visit reports redacted by the account officers of Geneva Bank. And that was the first contact and the first proofs, evidences that let's say, started the whole adventure endeavor. But that's
Can you
pretty correct.
explain why you're not physically in attendance? What is sort of the background to that? There's maybe some risk. Yeah, the Swiss have brought charges against you, right? And is there a risk of you being arrested should you come here?
Well, unfortunately, there are still a lot of risk pending over me, and unfortunately, I may have to add it's about the same for most of the European whistleblowers, especially, but not only, of course. Anyway, in my case, specific case, there are many reasons, but of course, always this one, that is that even if at the same time I'm collaborating, I'm still pursuing, works with general attorneys from many countries, with administrations, tax administrations for many countries. At the same time, I have no, of course, immunity all around. I mean, outside of the few countries where I'm working, and with US, it's not that evident. It's not because, of course, I'm part or I will be involved in works, in investigations, that I'm not exposed, of course, to other risk. This is how it is.
Well, the funny thing is, if you had visited the United States, there would have been this very odd situation, because I think there is an Interpol red notice against you of the United States, having a decision to make and possibly being forced to arrest a tax whistleblower and possibly send them off to the arch enemy being Switzerland, which would have been fascinating. Not much.
Well, not for everyone, maybe fascinating.
Not for you, but for me it would have been fascinating.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. That's exactly the kind of situation I was facing. Even when I was already inside the bank, it was perfectly clear that I had no teeny possibility, to avoid those risks. And that's why the story required to be a bit complex, and much more complex than more of the other whistleblower stories.
So, which countries are you assisting at the moment with their investigations?
Right now, apart from US, there are Argentina, recently also Brazil declared, but it's an ongoing, just starting process. So Brazil also asked for support. So Belgium, France, Italy, Spain, Greece, and India. So just to name a few, but the more prominent one, here it is. The last information that were given about the countries having requested help to France with regard to HSBC case revealed that over 30 countries had asked support to France Department of Justice. Let's see how it will evolve, but it's open rooms, slots for much more collaboration, of course.
How long have you been assisting the United States authorities?
We started more than 5 years ago now, and it's been pretty tough collaboration. It was really hard to proceed from France, and Well, we have we can share now more elements to understand why it was and it is still, difficult process. Among them, of course, the fact that I'm not citizen, I'm not US citizen, the fact that I'm still under Interpol warrant, all those elements and the political ambient, the government for years let maybe remind that when US Department of Justice asked for legal assistance to French investigators, well, it was refused for 3 years. And we had to wait for a change in the government, in the French government, for this collaboration request being accepted, So I expect it can, let's say, explain a bit more what kind of difficulties, issues you have to face when you are dealing with European banks. And I maybe have to later on explain why I'm saying European banks rather than Switzerland banks. But already, if I say when you are working with European bank, it's because in offshore banking, banks are not working alone, of course.
So just to fully understand, so the US want your cooperation. It was held up for 3 years because of bureaucracy and maybe political issues. They've been resolved now, and you are actively sort of cooperating. Is that true?
Well, it's still ongoing. It's still really hard to proceed. Of course, the momentum is that with such event, worldwide event as was the Swiss Leak, orchestrated with by ICIG, of course, it pushed forward, the investigation. It maybe resume the interest for the HSBC, but HSBC is such a special case. It's such prominent bank in Europe, and when you add to that considerations the fact that you have also pending treaties, agreements that are interesting US and Europe, and when you see the place of this bank, when you see, let's say, geopolitical ambient, you understand that whatever you want or you try to do with regard to offshore banking in Europe, it's even if it's related to U.S. interests, it's pretty difficult. There are not only one bank. There is not only one bank. There are many banks that are involved in the ongoing investigation. So, it's not on your hands. You don't have all the elements when you are just, in such a big story and in front of such big bank.
Whistleblowers in the United States are, they stand to make a lot of money through the Whistleblower Rewards Program. And in fact, Bradley Bergenfeld, who's here on stage, is the poster boy for that, having received $104 million gross, although probably not net. And
we wish him more.
As a foreign national, are you eligible for a reward in the United States? And have you retained an attorney to assist you with that process?
Well, of course, I am eligible for rewards, and right now, yeah, we are still pursuing, the efforts. First of all, to have action to be taken, with regard to the bank, because of course, the origin of my action was to put a stop on the way, the bank was behaving, that agreed itself in behaving absolutely in an absolutely illegal way, So my first and ongoing effort with lawyers from US, from France, and other countries is to get the investigation in US with regard to this bank to resume, or let's say to go further. And well, it's ongoing right now. It's simply ongoing.
I mean, if I were in your shoes, I would know that I was sitting on a commodity that has a substantial value, and I personally don't see any problem with you trying to monetize that. I think that's the most normal thing in the world.
Yeah, the thing is that you had, and it was really important first to do a risk assessment, to understand what was the reality of my situation in the bank when I've been first, in possession of the evidences showing what was doing the bank. This was, I mean, the risk assessment was the first, really the first thing that came to my mind, not the commodity aspect of the evidences I had in hands. Because not to forget, it is and it was the first bank in Europe. It was a huge banking group, not to say the biggest by the extent and by the, let's say, just to give an idea, the extent of its intranet. The HSBC owns the biggest private intranet on earth, and well, so the first concern and the first thing that got my attention was just to do a risk assessment about what I should do, and that's why from the beginning I was not, and I not turned to just one tax administration, and not only to tax administration, but also to other secret services. As soon as I could, I had just to securize the situation the most possible.
Has there been any country that hasn't shown much interest or maybe any interest? I know in the United Kingdom there has been some public criticism of the government for failing to act on your information.
Well, there are different ways to answer to that question. You can observe and you can try to understand what are the countries that are interested in going after the clients first. Afterward, you can count or review the countries that are interested in going after the banks, the local banks that helped the clients to evade taxes. And the third way to answer that question is to review what are the countries that were exposed through their clients to this fraud that are interested in going after the holding. And depending on the strategy you observe countries are following, it helps understanding how much politics it is controlling the Department of Justice strategy or not. It's to me it's pretty clear that the first level, I mean, focusing on the client is the simplest but the less efficient to me, because my objective and the characteristic of the information I hand over were that there were explaining mechanisms, explaining that of course without account officers, without managers, the bank was not supporting, I mean, was not able to support tax evasion. It was just, and it is just a system that we had to ask to be changed. Not only clients to pay back what they didn't first.
So has the United Kingdom shown much interest? Yes.
Not really,
yes or no?
indeed.
Not really.
Well, now there was, thanks to, of course, Swiss Leak also. They started to question the bank, the executive board of directors, and we can expect it to be an ongoing process. But when you observe also what was the last statement from the bank, explaining that it could be an option for them to move their headquarters from London to other countries. And when you observe that Mr. Gulliver was explaining that, and the time chosen to say to give such statement that it was just due to the coming elections, you understand a bit more what kind of war, not that undercover anymore, but what kind of political war and what kind of effort are done, and well, I don't expect to say differently. I don't expect. I will be really surprised if England, will go after the holding.
Right. How did you get the information out of the bank?
Well, the world, all of the information I received, I got them through a kind of cloud, a kind of computer infrastructure. And well, today it's a bit more usual to have such infrastructure, but at that time it was just given by the people, I started to ask support for. And that gave it to me as a way to access the information. I may have to precise that the cloud, of course, was not inside the bank. It was accessed and accessible from the internet.
So there was a serious flaw in the bank's system? Well,
there were many flaw in the sense that what I obtained through the cloud were a lot of information from a lot of different systems in the bank. In most of the banking industry, you rely on a lot of different softwares, let's say, to put it simple. For instance, for HSBC, it could have been 150 different softwares that were used just to support the the day-to-day work of the employees, of course. So in the cloud, I got access to most of the software, the information and the data that were used and present in the software of the banks. So to get that, of course, it required a lot of work, a lot of leak from different departments of the bank. But on my side, I never had to get access to one of them directly. I had just the whole access through the cloud. Once those information being copied from the internal bank.
Did other employees of the bank assist you?
Yes, of course. In the sense, I never had the credentials to access to those systems. As I explained initially, I was in charge of the technical analysis of the strategic project, meaning that I had just to assess what could be changed in the system, what could be enhanced, and how to do so in a way to comply with business strategies. And this was my duty in the bank, from Monte Carlo to Geneva, from the headquarters. So I always had to just make assessment on what needed to be changed and how on the system. And thanks to that role, I had to move over all the most sensitive system in the bank, but never having credentials, meaning I was working on the plans, on the design of the system. And this was the reason why, of course, also I've been able to indicate what were the sensitive systems that were important, the more important among the 150 systems existing. My main contribution to the cloud was just to identify what were the systems that we needed to prove and to give the information Department of Justice may need. And in an ongoing process, with the support of the person, the person I ask to give support, they went to the person in charge of the system. Most of the time, I just identify the system and the department where they can have access to, and they hand over that, and they did that without, implying my contribution.
Has any country declined your information, refused your information?
Well, you had the case of Italy that didn't. First of all, when you in Europe, if you go to countries, with information you can't prove the legal provenance of those information, and you won't have any investigation started. If I was just going to France, to Italy, with the information, the way I had them, and if I was offering the information, no information will have been able to be started. And it is still the same right now. So in one sense, every country in Europe except Germany will have refused the information and will refuse the information right now if we were just doing the same that I did years ago. So officially, no European country outside of Germany will have accepted the information or will accept. After that, even when through legal treaties, agreement, cooperation, Department of Justice cooperation agreement that exists between countries, European countries, even under such agreement, you have the case of Italy that is pretty interesting to observe, that is showing that even when they receive through the legal channels the information, they are not always able to use them, meaning that we had to wait until last week to have the main court, the main Italian court, stating that the judge can finally use those information, whereas until last week there was a flaw. There was no certainty that the information and that the investigation, civilian investigation, could have been effective.
Okay, I've just got one final question. Of the business that at HSBC that you're familiar with, what percentage do you estimate is criminal or otherwise illegal?
What decided me to go on, to start and to blow the whistle was that no effective control was possible in the bank. That no system was efficient enough to ensure that terrorism or money laundering was under scrutiny, under control. So it's not about the percentage, it was about the efficiency. And it was so evident, so clear that even with, the visit report clear enough to be read by anyone, not only bankers, but even, people able to read, it was clear enough that it was insane what was ongoing. So my estimate is that, and was at the time that it was, it's also due to the legal system, to the Switzerland legal system, but it was clear that it was out of control. It was, and I was in a bank that was absolutely out of control. So pretty, in terms of percentage, I don't know how to say that, but I would have said that I was 100% certain that it was a system out of control.
Okay, those are all the questions I have. If anyone, maybe we can take one or two questions if any members of the audience have any questions for Hervé before he goes. Okay, well, thanks, Hervé. I'll let you go now. I know it's quite late in France, and we're going to have a panel discussion now. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, so now Dean is basically going to sort of organize proceedings, right, Dean? Right. And we'll throw it open now to Brad, Dean, and Gerard.
Great. Thanks very much for having us all here. We've got some questions kind of more on the UBS side of the house, and domestic side, and also on the global side, and so focus on that. So we'll go through whistle internally at UBS, and for folks here, sorry about that, to kind of hear this, because I think that's an aspect that wasn't really brought forward about that you would try to internally discuss all these things.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here today, and I think it's important after what Hervé had just told us with respect to what I did at UBS, the largest bank in the world, and exposing the longest and largest tax fraud in U.S. history. It took one person to do that, and that was myself. But I started doing this internally at UBS, and I think, Dean, you're correct, is that it's important to understand within a corporate environment, not only a corporate environment, but a corporate environment in a foreign country in which the laws are very strict. And those laws are so strict, and as an expat, it makes it even more difficult. So those are some of the parameters there just to start and internally whistleblow against the largest bank in the world. So I think that's important to start first internally, but there's arguments on both sides of the coin, and that being that sometimes if you blow the whistle internally, the corporation is going to bury it, as they did in the UBS case with me. Whereas you don't need to just go running around to regulatory and law enforcement just to think that you're going to blow the whistle because you think you have some information. So I think it's very important to have a strategic plan in place that you're doing it properly, but also you're not just doing it out of malice or spite. There's a real reason, and it's justified on what you're doing.
So thanks for that. David Marchand have been good to kind of give us some ideas of topics, so I'm going to kind of use those and go through some of the points that he raised. He had asked about the treatment of whistleblowers, I think really kind of in terms of tax whistleblowers in the U.S., and I know, Brad, you had your experience as the last American who's going to work for UBS in Switzerland. But I would say that despite Brad, the treatment of whistleblowers, because I have worked kind of a broader range, is extremely good. I find that the government across the board is very engaged with the whistleblowers. We've got a number of them here, Carolyn Schenk, Dan Reeves, Don Applebaum from the Whistleblower Office, who unfortunately isn't here. Just kind of a small sampling, but I find FBI, DOJ, IRS in particular are very good at protecting the whistleblower's identity because of our 6103 laws. I just find across the board it's not a picnic basket overall, but in terms of the interaction and the working, there's obviously some problems with the program overall. But I would say in terms of dealing with the whistleblowers and being responsive and trying to work with them and putting them in a good place, I think they've done an excellent job. I know, Brad, you were kind of the test case that showed how not to do it, but I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, I think it's true. Initially, the hostility I got at the bank was quite amazing, and I was a director at the bank at UBS, head of business development. So, quite frankly, I found it odd that when I tried to whistleblow internally with legal and compliance, and I got no answer over several months, I found that it was quite insulting. But also it was putting myself, my colleagues, the clients, and the shareholders at risk. And you have to imagine, this is not just the US desk, this is globally. And as you heard from Hervé, contrary to the attorney who blithered lies up here yesterday, Raoul Weil knew exactly what was going on. This was a global bank, and it's a criminal organization that operated in every country around the world. So quite frankly, it's important to understand the magnitude and complexity of what we're talking about here. So just trying to say that you didn't know what was going on, I think is a little bit harsh. But as I came into the Department of Justice, I felt the hostility once again. And quite frankly, the results or lack thereof on their investigation are proof positive that I knew what I was talking about. And they failed to either, as Hervé said, and I'll mirror the same response, the political cover-up, as well as bureaucratic incompetence, because quite frankly, when you don't find the bank properly to make the Treasury whole, and you don't get all the names that you should have got that I gave them, and then you gave secret non-prosecution agreements to all the people that I gave the names to, and then attacked me, you realize what's going on here. This is not about justice, this is about attacking the whistleblower. So it's important to put that on the record and make sure that everybody knows that's exactly what happened. I didn't withhold information from the Department of Justice. To the contrary, they wouldn't give me a subpoena, and I would have violated Swiss bank secrecy, just as the bank said in the U.S. Senate committees. So quite frankly, I went to the U.S. Senate, and they were happy to give me a subpoena. That's all it took. Just give me a subpoena. So it's very important to keep the timeline and the facts straight and not to hear the lies that were perpetuated in front of my sentencing judge. So that's important.
Right. I would just kind of, on that though, I would say, and I know it was, I was not your attorney then, so that was problem one. But I think.
We rectified that.
That's right. Call me. No. But what I would say is I do think that in some sense DOJ didn't quite know how to dance with you and how to dance back and forth. I think in general it's been much better with folks coming forward now because of, I think, I don't want to put folks on the spot, but I think if you've got people in a quiet corner, they'd say that maybe wasn't kind of exactly how to run the railway on it. Just real quickly, what is the IRS looking for in a whistleblower case now? And just to give you a very quick sense of that, in terms of topics, obviously they're very interested, hugely interested in offshore still. They're interested in a wide range of things though. But what I would say to you is in terms of a type of a submission, they're going to want it to be current. If your story starts with, well, in 2002, not going to be a good story. They like it to be detailed. They want you to explain, in a sense, what happened so that they can read it and understand it very quickly, and also the understanding the underlying legal issue as well, too, that's explained to them. But in a sense, what you can think of, they've got a huge number of submissions coming in. You want to write something that they can quickly pick up, read, and say, I get it. I understand what's going on here. And they're going to want documents, if you have them, detailed documents, particularly in the area of the offshore. They're going to want to have names, addresses, TINs, social security numbers, anything like that to identify. Just to say that John Smith's got an offshore account, not so helpful. But documents, first-hand information helps a lot, not just I heard this once or my brother works there, you were there. They're going to want to say yes, because they're going to have to they've got limited resources at the IRS. They have got, it's an investment of their time, energy, and effort to be able to say, yeah, look, this guy's got it going on. This woman's in a senior position at the bank. She's, you get the idea that they're aware, they're knowledgeable. And I'd also encourage, that it's real dollars involved. While it's expansive now, when we wrote the law in the Senate, it was meant to really kind of focus on big ticket items. I still think that's where the IRS is interested in, is in the bigger dollar amounts. I do encourage you that you need to act promptly in terms of not horsing around and waiting, particularly in this area, the offshore. A lot of folks, I think, kind of come in after the gun's gone off. That's not going to move you along. And then that the money's collectible, that they are not bankrupt, that the funds are available. So those are kind of the quick indices of I think what the service looks for, and what I found in my practice that gets them kind of going. I mean, Brad, you might speak to that, how it reflects your case and why it moved.
Well, I think, the IRS was very receptive. I met with Dan Reeves and John McDougall, and I met with many agencies in the U.S. government because I was eager to talk to people and get the story out. So they were very receptive, and I tried to tell them as much as I could. You can imagine ducking and dodging Swiss authorities, UBS, sort of cloak and dagger type of thing. So it was important to come with, as Dean pointed out, with a real story that you could document. I mean, you didn't want to just come in and say, well, I just remember this or I remember that. So I had a lot of documentation that I moved out of Switzerland into the US and into France, because France was in close proximity to where I lived in Geneva. So I felt as though I couldn't trust the Swiss government and the Swiss bank. So coming in, it was important to sit down and try and give them a roadmap, if you will. And it's important because they're certainly intelligent. They know what's going on in the offshore world, obviously a lot more now because of what I did back in 2007. But certainly it's always helpful to give them other information that helps. And no one's going to push away documentation, I would hope. As Hervé mentioned, some governments have, but that's another issue. And I've had that with a few foreign governments as well that haven't really done much with the information I gave them. But That being said, the IRS, the SEC were very receptive, and we got a lot out of this deal, but certainly I feel, and even to this day, a lot more could have been done. I don't put that on the SEC or the IRS. I put it more on the Department of Justice. So there is a bit of a sort of a tongue-in-cheek there between us, and certainly they're certainly not my best friends, as you can imagine. But no, I think it's important to help and to do it in the right way, and that's what I tried to do.
Thanks. One other question that Dave suggested I thought was a good one was kind of I'm combined just the IRS whistleblower claim process. Is it efficient and fair? And then kind of overall what can be done to improve the whistleblower program? And I think of this particularly, and you can talk a little bit about what maybe foreign countries should look at. I think in terms of the claims process, the actual awarding of it, I think the whistleblower office itself, and that's who does the awards and decides the awards. It's basically kind of a subunit of the entire IRS. They do a very excellent job. I think they're quite fair, and I think when I look at it, and it's not like the clients get every penny they win, but when you look at it and they're discussing it, I do think that they're squared away in terms of how they're putting forward what they're looking at. There can be some problems that are more legal that we're going through the courts on that have been problematic, but kind of once you've got them in the crosshairs of yes, this is what you want to do and how you're doing it, I think that they're squared away on that. I think the things that you need to be mindful, though, in terms of the fairness of the program, is for those out there. When the whistleblower office is one shop, and I think they're good advocates for the program and good advocates for the whistleblowers. The Office of the Chief Counsel in Washington that handles the litigation has historically not been a hug monkey when it comes to the whistleblower program, and has been a problem in court. And I think something for practitioners out there in this area need to be aware of is they have made arguments such as, well, you gave us all the information, but then you later filed the 211. I have a case that I'm still kind of stupefied where they had a woman wear a wire. She had 2 small children, put her in harm's way twice, and they knew she wanted an award, and they said, oh, and they got huge amounts of money and a big recovery thanks to her, and they then said, oh, well, no, you didn't file your 211, that's the form you have to file for the award. You didn't file that before or after you did that, so thanks, but no thanks. This kind of technical reading, I think hopefully we'll kind of get through the system and get to the courts and get out of the way, but it's unfortunate that you see that. So kind of a lesson for you all is make sure you're filing your 211s as you come through the door. I think another important thing is that you're talking to IRS, Treasury officials. I know a lot of it's natural. You're talking to a DOJ or an FBI person. Again, kind of in this odd reading and footfall by some of the lawyers who wake up more thinking how to closely read the program, that they'll say, well, that wasn't good enough. You need to be talking to Treasury and IRS officials. So just as a technical point to you, that you need to be mindful of your P's and Q's about how you do this, because unfortunately, there are folks that kind of wake up thinking, how can we rook the program? I think the biggest issue out there, though, that whistleblowers face is really transparency and openness in discussion with the IRS. It'd be nice if there was engaging in more contracts, working with folks closely like they've done with Brad. And they have done it in some other areas, but there's still a lot more room for improvement. When we wrote the law, it was intended that the IRS could benefit from these folks helping pull the oars, bringing their knowledge and detailed understanding of what was going on. It really hasn't quite met that. It does every once in a while sporadically, but it doesn't. But the other problem is then you're kind of stuck in a sense of you've given the information, you provided it, maybe you've had a meeting with the IRS, but then it's all radio silent after that, and it can be very frustrating for the whistleblowers. You can imagine that, where am I? Have they considered it? Are they taking action? Is there, because it'll be years, obviously, before the funds have been collected and you're actually available for an award. So those are things that, they know it. It's not a secret that transparency is a problem. I think we'll see how things progress. Congress is continuing to look at the program and improvement. I think it's a bipartisan support for the program in the Congress, but there's certainly things we can do to improve it. They're getting lots of good information. But Brad, any comment you want to make on that? We'll turn it over to our good journalist around here.
Well, what I found interesting when I started the process, again, you have to imagine it's a very hard step to move forward, especially in this regard, because it was, again, the magnitude was so big, and it affected not just the American clients, but the bank's clients worldwide. because what happened was ultimately Swiss bank secrecy has been destroyed, and now that clients have been coming through, not just in the offshore voluntary disclosure program, but a lot of money has moved out of Switzerland into other jurisdictions, as we've discussed in these panels here. So money's been moving around the world as a result of my actions, and I think the problem here is that you're not just trying to find the people who are cheating on their taxes, which was predominantly at UBS because we had a declared and an undeclared desk, so you could actually find out exactly who was doing what. So it was quite clear in that respect, unlike other jurisdictions that don't have that type of delineation. So what happens here is that you have to look at some of the other serious crimes that exist as a result of lack of transparency and accountability, which is extortion, bribery, insider trading, dictators and so forth that use these funds for illegal purposes. And we saw that quite often in Switzerland, and I knew many of the bankers that knew the stories of Marcos's money at Citibank and Gaddafi's money at Pictet and so forth. So it was common knowledge among bankers in closed circles that that was there. And then I defer to my gentleman on the right here, Gerard, about the media, and I thought the media was a very integral part of what I was doing because I reached out to Haig Simonian of the Financial Times when I first started this as a clandestine informant, because I felt as though if you didn't inform the media, they're a great outlet to refute what other people would try and bring you down and debunk your story. So I think that's a big part of the whistleblowing as well.
So, well, thank you for that perfect baton toss for me. I wanted to get over to Gerard. So let's talk about that. What do you, first kind of talk to us a little bit about what is ICIJ, but then tell us how you see the role of the media in all this.
Yeah, look, I think no surprise from me that there's no better way of getting attention from authorities than to get front pages of newspapers around the world. And let me tell you, when we published the HSBC story in February, we published in 45 major news outlets around the world all at the same time. And there was nobody more surprised than Hervé Falciani, because in fact we didn't actually get any material from him. Now, let me take a step back here. I think what he did was amazing, but everything we got was actually came in a different way. Look, let me tell you about me. I'm an investigative reporter. I've spent most of my career in Australia, but I'm Irish, grew up in Ireland. And about 3.5 years ago, I was invited to take over the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. And what this is a very small non-profit. It's actually part of a larger non-profit called the Center for Public Integrity, which is based in Washington. And what we do is we bring investigative reporters from around the world together to work on major cross-border projects. We are a network primarily of reporters. We've got about 200 reporters who are part of our network in about 65 countries. But in the last 3.5 years, since I took over, I've really moved it also to a network of major publishers. So essentially what we do is we don't see ourselves as a primary publisher, even though we're an investigative organization. We see our partners. So when we partner with 60 Minutes, or the Guardian newspaper or the BBC, they're our primary publishers. We also do stories, but we sort of more like a service industry. We find the stories for them, we build the tools that they use, and basically my job is to find great stories that I can go to these newspaper partners or TV partners and basically sell as a good story.
So talk to me, I mean, you had this story hit the press across the board. How do you view this? Was this a seismic change? What's your take on the impact?
Well, I think they've been, the reason we're able to exist these days and the reason why we're able to thrive is because there's been huge seismic changes in the media itself. I mean, the businesses that have supported the media traditionally, you know, advertising, are dying. The traditional media is dying. And that means that they're actually more willing to listen to collaborations than ever been before. There's also been another major seismic change in the last 6 or 7 years from the same, basically from the advance of technology. And that is allowing people like Hervé to collect information on a scale that we never thought possible before. I mean, 20 years ago, it would take you years to go through the kind of information that these people are now collecting. and that journalists like ours are actually going through, because we're using technology to view this information and to use lots of shortcuts. So there are two major changes that have happened out there. The technology that is killing journalism is actually now beginning to save journalism because we're reinventing journalism in a new way.
So why don't you talk to us kind of how your shop works, but how it really worked in relation to the investigation of the bank of HSBC?
Yeah, look, we have become known for working in the offshore world. We do other kinds of stories. We had all heard, every journalist in the world had heard about Hervé Falciani and his files. There was a famous case in Greece where 2,000 names from the files were handed to the Greek government, and the minister who received the names promptly lost them for nearly 2 years. And when they re-emerged, 5 members of his own family had disappeared. And when a journalist got a hold of the list and published it, he was put in jail. So this became known as the Lagarde list after Christine Lagarde, who's now the head of the IMF. She, at the time, was the justice minister in France. And when Hervé had handed the material to the French government back in 2008, it was another 2 years before the French government started giving the material out to other governments. And of course, in 2010, the Greek names went to Greece, and that's what happened. Now, there'd been a well-worn path to Hervé's door since then by every journalist in the world, including me. When I first heard about this, I started visiting him in 2013. And, like every other journalist, he was happy to court us. But it was quite clear to me, after about 6 months of seeing him, that I was never going to get the material. So at that point, I started asking around who else had it. And I was given the name of a journalist at Le Monde, a guy called Gerard Devet. And he and another guy called Fabrice Lehome, they work together. They're crazy characters. They're actually the only journalists I know in the first world country that have got a full-time police escort. And it's not because of their work on this, but because they do a lot of stories into crime. So every time you meet them, they have a full police escort. It's a bit like meeting Hervé, actually, in Paris. They had the names, and like most journalists, they were only interested in the French names. So they published the story in Le Monde. And once I found out they had the material, of course, we had worked with Le Monde in the past a few times. I started lobbying their editors for access to the other names, the non-French names. And at that point, Le Monde thought, we can do this story ourselves, we don't need ICIJ, and they handed the names out to their 30 or so foreign bureaus. And at that point I said, well, look, if you try and you fail, can you come back to me? Here's my number. And within about 2 weeks I got the phone call, and within a week later we had the 2 reporters over from France, and they brought the material with them, and that's where it started.
Very interesting. And then you published, but talk to me about that. When I was in the Senate, I worked for Senator Grassley, who was well known for his oversight, and we would do all of our oversight in the press and in the public, and not to the joy of whatever administration we were grinding. And it was because we found that no matter how eloquent or clever or witty our letters were, it never convinced anybody to do anything about what we were writing about. But if we said, hey, hold on, I think that might be 60 Minutes on the other line calling you, suddenly they got very interested in what we had to say. So we found it as a tool. I mean, did you find, talk to us about getting it published, and talk to us about what you've seen as the impact of getting it published and getting out there.
Well, there were about 6,000 files that he had gathered, that we had access to, actually, because what we found out we had access to was the French tax investigation into the files. And so it was pretty early days into the investigation, and there were about 6,000 raw bits of material, spreadsheets of names of the customers. But probably the most interesting part of what we were seeing were the notes that had been written by the bankers about their customers. And that told us a whole lot of things that we thought might be of public interest, secret shareholdings they had in public companies and other things. So we, as our first step always, we had to create a searchable database so that the journalists that we would later invite on board were able to search this material easily. And because it was so scattered and broken, it took us about 2 months to build that database. In the meantime, we were able to use this very sophisticated software called Nuix, which we get donated to us by the company, to basically do basic searches at the beginning. So we digested everything into Nuix, and then I started inviting reporters from around the world to come over to Washington to look at the material. Because what I was very interested in doing at this point was establishing public interest. I wanted to get away from any argument that we were just looking we recognize the names. There were Hollywood stars in here. There were public figures, dictators, politicians around the world. There were, in fact, names from about 200 different countries. So I invited reporters one by one to come to Washington to look at this and get them to tell me whether or not this was of interest to their audiences.
Very interesting on that. I wanted to kind of ask both you gentlemen kind of some questions on more of a global sense of it, and you've got a good perspective, and Brad, you've got yours. Just globally, how do you view that whistleblowers are being treated in this area, and the incentivizations that are out there for them? You want to start with that, or Brad?
Well,
Or how are they being punished?
Well, I don't think it's very uneven around the world. In some countries, if you're lucky enough to have information that has got to do with Germany, then you're very well treated if you go to the right people. Here in the US, I think it's a little bit up and down. I mean, I know that you're very praising of the whistleblower acts that are here. I think it's amazing. I think it's fantastic that there is a whistleblower act, that you can actually have key time, that you can get rewarded for it. I think it should be extended around the world. I think people should actually be rewarded for this. That's my position. But it's very uneven how some people are treated. And a lot of it is, I really would encourage them to, come to me, obviously, to get some help.
Well, I think you're right, and I think it is an uneven playing field, and I think I'm proof positive of that. I've recently been in Paris helping the French investigate UBS. As UBS says, I don't know what I'm talking about, and it's an old story. Well, unfortunately, they put up 1.1 billion euros as bail, so quite frankly, they have a bigger problem than I do. So what I've been trying to do is help other governments, and some of them that I get a very strange feedback, as we just discussed here, in Canada. For instance, in Canada, I was a whistleblower back in 2008. They've done nothing, absolutely nothing. And quite frankly, in Canada, they're actually a larger problem in the offshore tax evasion than the US, because they're a country of about 30 million people, whereas in the US it's about 330 million. At UBS, we had about 19,000 clients and 20 billion in assets. But up there, they had about 5 billion in assets. So why hasn't anything been done in Canada over 7 years? 7 years. We've reached out to them, we've told them, we've given them the information. Nothing, absolutely nothing. So that's a perfect example of where things can go wrong, and I'm helping other countries, just like Hervé had mentioned here. He's helping other countries because we know how the banks operate, not just in one country, but they did this. It was a footprint. It was a template to operate globally, and HSBC, like UBS, was a global institution. So whether you were in India or you were in France or you were in the US, you certainly did this business, and they know it, and that's just what happened over the years.
I think just thanks for the point about more laws like this globally. Amen. I think the National Whistleblower Center, which I'm a non-paid, I don't know what I am. I just get free coffee. I don't know what. Anyways, some kind of consultant. But Brad's co-counsel on this, Steve Cohn, he has done a lot of work going overseas trying to do exactly this and be the Johnny Appleseed of, and interesting, the State Department's actually been supporting his efforts to go overseas to do exactly that, to try to make folks aware of it, make them aware, because it has so, all the secrecy and the failure to reward whistleblowers has so many ramifications. We talk about it with the offshore, but then the ripple effect beyond that. So I think it's something that I know, Brad, you're interested in, and I think for countries overseas here are listening or reading this later, I think looking at those laws and putting them in place and having them to protect them and encourage them, and that kind of segues into the next question I was going to ask you, and I'll sort of, it's just kind of what can you do to incentivize whistleblowers, and maybe I'll start just by answering what we found on the tax side was mimicking the False Claims Act, exactly what you said, and there's really kind of three key pieces to it. Is there was a whistleblower program at the IRS that was a complete joke before we changed the law. Basically, it was run out of a shoebox, and it seemed an enormous number of folks who were unhappy with their wives or their husbands was the main source of it. But you need to, A, ensure that they have a right to a payment for an award, not a, well, woulda, coulda, shoulda, maybe, you know, if you're wearing good socks today, I'll give you an award, that kind of a deal. So you're dedicated that you're going to get a payment. Two, that you have a parameter for the payment. In other words, in the whistleblower law, it's 15 to 30%, but at least you've got a kind of a floor and a ceiling of where you're going to be. And then third, you do have an independent review. You don't have, in this case, the tax court can review it, as opposed to you're kind of at the mercy of the agency itself saying, well, I don't know about you. And so those are the three. You can have more like false claims being able to go to court like New York does. And I should have mentioned New York has a very good QI-TAM tax provision. But those are the three, I think, if you had to kind of start with anything, kind of core elements of getting folks forward, because, and I think it's then issuing awards, because I would say after Brad got his check, and the reason Brad's public, by the way, is because we elected to make him public. He could have gone anonymous and gotten his money, but we wanted, you know, because of Brad's kind of unique journey, get him out there. But it was hugely helpful. They didn't take my idea at Treasury of having them give him a really big check at an awards ceremony. But the impact was almost as good, because after Brad, we just saw, you know, rolling out like oranges, folks who are, because this is the kind of person you want, or even more senior, quite frankly, just so you get it. I mean, particularly in tax and particularly in offshore, and I'm sure you found this, it's an area that you need people who really have got the access, have got it going and understanding. I would say particularly in tax, even as a tax attorney, you could show me a layout. Well, if I don't have a Sherpa explaining to me what the transaction was, I still probably can't figure out what went on. I mean, you've got to have that, but those people are going to be senior, well-placed folks who've got a lot on their lines, a career on the lines, so you've got to, you know, be willing to award them. So I think awarding them, I know it had a big change on the quality of folks coming forward, but anyways, enough on me. Your fellows' thoughts on it?
Well, I think you're right. I think it was important to announce this because, number one, as Dean mentioned, my journey, but to let other people know that, again, to remember the timeline in my case, I did not do this for the money. I had started whistleblowing prior to the law being enacted by Dean, who had authored the law. So that's very important. The second thing is to look at what's the ramifications of paying such an amount. And quite frankly, the U.S. government got billions of dollars, and they paid me pennies on the dollar for this. So it's probably, as Dean mentioned years ago, it's the best investment the U.S. government's ever made by paying me. So why wouldn't you want to do this, as well as stopping out crime? And remember, the money comes back into the U.S. Treasury through perpetuity. All that money comes back into the U.S. banking system from the Swiss banking system. So it gets invested, it gets taxed, it gets paid salaries and so forth. So you can't even comprehend the exponential effect of what I've done, because this will go on forever. But also, protecting whistleblowers is very important, and I think in Europe, as we've touched upon, it's very difficult to get the mindset around paying someone for giving information like this. And you don't want to run around, as Dean mentioned, just to say, well, geez, I want to turn in my husband or my wife or whatever because they're cheating on their taxes. But protecting people is very important, because people are taking a huge risk with their career, their reputation, and possibly their family if they're married with children. So that's very important to understand that that must be done, and I think governments in Europe are the first place where it should start, and that's something that I'm going to put my time and energy to help, and I've been doing that so far.
I should have mentioned brothers-in-law, strangely enough, were a huge factor, people being whistleblown before the law changed. I don't know why that tension was there. Gerard, take us through, kind of, you've got the better sense of maybe of all of us of the scale of the problem globally, tax evasion, offshore. How are you seeing that from your perspective?
Well, the truth is that no one really knows how much money is offshore. Even here, I was surprised to listen to the estimates that were going around. But I mean, the figure that we sometimes use, but again, this is from people who are anti-tax havens, is that about a third of all global wealth and half of all world trade goes through tax havens. So we're talking about an enormous amount of money, but no one really knows how much, because mostly it's secret. I mean, what the offshore world sells is one product, it's secrecy. And take away that secrecy, and I think it's people like Brad that basically are damaging the offshore world in a way that no one else can, because as soon as you reveal secrecy, then everyone's going to be worried that at some point or other, they're also going to be revealed. I mean, I think, like what you said is right. I mean, what's happened now is that people are getting nervous, and they're going forward and self-declaring. And I think, the IRS must be sitting back thinking, this is fantastic. Never had it so easy.
Right, and I think it's that atmosphere of sensing, hey, who's the next Brad Birkenfeld, and putting folks in concern. But Brad, how do you view the global tax?
Well, it's true. I mean, I think we all agree, and I think there's a lot of professionals here older than me that seen a lot of things as well in the offshore world. We don't know what the number is, and you'll never know the number because whether it's been invested in artwork or in commodities or safe deposit boxes or secret bank accounts or even cash in safes, you just don't know what's out there. So that's a big problem. So transparency is very important. But I think the problem is that certainly this has caused a paradigm change in the way in which people do banking in Switzerland, obviously, but in other jurisdictions. And certainly law enforcement is doing what they need to do to rectify that. But unfortunately, it's probably something that will take years to really come to grips with, where they'll start to have sort of a flat system across the globe. I'm not saying it's going to be uniform, but what I am saying is that I think it's making changes step by step, and I think we've seen that over the last decade.
I thought this was a good question. Which banks, other service providers, and jurisdictions are the worst culprits? Now, I know it's no one here, of course, so that you don't have to worry about that, but if maybe you gentlemen can both give your thoughts and take on that without, as your lawyer, putting you into libels. So go ahead.
I think it was the Marchand Bank, wasn't it? Dave Marchand? No. No, I think, what was very interesting is to listen to Hervé here, because he mentioned a few things that were very interesting, and he touched upon a few things that were quite important. HSBC had no controls for terrorist financing. They couldn't tell you what one client was doing versus another. Certainly, I think in the UBS case, I think they turned a blind eye to a lot of the things they did, and I have some documents up on the screen, which I'll share with you folks through this process. And it's very compelling, extremely compelling, because it was given to the Department of Justice back in June 19th, 2007, and nothing was done. So that's very important. So I think there are a variety of banks. When I lived in Geneva, there was 124 banks in Geneva, but there's 200,000 people. So what you're saying is there's about 1,650 people per capita per bank, and it wasn't Swiss money in those banks. So you can only imagine from that magnitude, it gives you an idea exactly what was going on. And there was a book, there's a very famous book, which is no longer published, called the Vernlin Directory. And the Vernlin Directory actually broke down every trust company and bank in Switzerland and Liechtenstein. And it was very comprehensive, and I have several of them. They're as thick as a Bible, they're quite thick. And the information in there is just staggering. And I think that's something to get your arms around, to see the magnitude of what we're talking about, the banks that are involved in this business. But also, here in the States, UBS was referring business from the States to Switzerland. So it's not just Switzerland. It's other institutions and other banks sending monies to the banks in Switzerland, because the fees are higher and it's generally a one-way street. Once the money comes to Switzerland, it stays in Switzerland.
Gerard, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think generally, first of all, I don't know, because until you get evidence of something, you really can't say that there's wrongdoing. But it would seem to me reasonably a safe assumption that almost every financial institution in the world, to some extent, is doing bad things. It's just the nature of the game. And I really, let me just see the bigger picture here. The bigger picture here is that there's a financial incentive for first world countries to allow the system to continue, because a lot of the money that we're looking at in HSBC and we've seen in other cases, it's all coming from the third world. And so you've got a tin pot dictator in Africa who basically hides his money here. Even people from China, we saw huge amounts of money flowing through the British Virgin Islands back in here to real estate. One of the reasons why real estate in New York is so high is because you've got a lot of crooks that are parking their money there. And it makes sense when you stop to think about it. They don't want to have the money in Russia or China where they might eventually lose it. It's a safe bet to buy art, houses, other bits and pieces of property, real things that you can cash in later if you have to escape quickly. And so therefore, we're all actually, because we live in this first world, we're all benefiting from this. The entire British financial system is benefiting, and so is the US financial system. So therefore, what I'm saying is that there's no real incentive for the first world to end this.
Well, just to add to that, I think we can all recall Bank of New York accepting billions and billions of dollars of Russian money. And that was, I think, around 15 years ago. And that was never really tracked down. The money just vanished. It went to so many different counterparts. So that, again, it's another incentive. The money comes in and it goes into investments and so forth, whether it's into publicly listed companies or real estate, artwork, what have you. And I think this is what we saw at UBS, was that people made so many different investments across the board. I mean, we used to have people who would sell us wine vineyards in France. So you're in America, you buy a wine vineyard. Well, what a wonderful thing to have. I mean, it looks nice, it's wonderful, but you park your money there and it's actually a safe asset. So it covers the total spectrum. And I think you can't just put your finger on one area and say, oh, it's just a bank account or it's just a real estate opportunity. It's everything.
So what's the new then that's going?
Well, I've always said, even when I was in Switzerland, the money laundering that happened through artwork. Artwork was a great conduit. I buy a Picasso for 20 million, and then Dean buys it from me for 30 million, and then Gerard buys it from him for 40 million, and we've all laundered our money through that, and it's secret. No one knows. There's no transaction. There's no receipt. It just happens to be that I get some money, Dean gets some money, and Gerard has a painting in his living room. And some people do that because it's an easy way to launder your money. One of the other ways that we saw was that before the euro came into play, we saw a lot of Germans and French going down to the Mediterranean to buy homes for cash. And a lot of people were approached to sell their homes, and they didn't want to sell, but people paid so much with cash, they took the money. And that was with Deutschmarks and French francs and so forth. But then what happened was then the euro came into play and the house went up in value 25%. And you laundered your money. And you got a piece of real estate. I mean, perfect example.
Now I know why I can't afford a Matisse in the Caymans, for my Cayman's house, or the Cayman's house. Let me ask you this kind of, Brad, or did you want to comment about anything about the new that you, just, let's go back to the UBS situation, really more beyond just, well, they could have done this right or done that right, and you're going to have to answer the question without using the word vile in it. But what do you think of it that you look at UBS and say, well, I wish they had done this, but really think beyond that, Brad, in terms of what do you think are the lessons learned from UBS as the government is looking at other banks to prosecute?
Well, it's a long-winded question, but I'll try and condense it down. There were a lot of things they did wrong and a lot of things that happened there. So I think what happened to an extent was that there was a lot of arrogance. You have to understand the history of UBS and get into the mindset of the bank itself. There were three big banks in Switzerland: Credit Suisse, Swiss Bank Corp, and UBS. And UBS made a hostile takeover and took in Swiss Bank Corp. So three became two. So that was the first thing. The second thing is most of the people that worked at Swiss Bank Corp and UBS were military folks in the Swiss military. So there was a mindset there, a regimented sense. So I researched this extensively when I was there, and I used to go into the archives at Credit Suisse where I worked, as well as UBS. And I found so many different documents that were so compelling. And it gave me an idea about how this whole system worked. It was part of the culture. By indicting UBS, it'd be like indicting the Swiss government. They're co-conspirators. They're part of it. They're holding hands. I mean, that's very important to understand that. A lot of people might argue with me, but I know I'm right because, quite frankly, you can see what's been going on, especially in the UBS case with the U.S. But I think the problem with UBS was that they did it to such an extent with a level of arrogance, in so much as putting the colleagues and the clients and shareholders at risk, but also thumbing their nose at the U.S. authorities and other authorities in other countries, for that matter. So it was across the board such it was like an organized crime outfit. And I say that quite candidly because this is a publicly listed company. When in fact they get fined, then they write that off as a tax write-off. So the Swiss citizens have to pick up that. Then the shareholders who had nothing to do with it, they lose because the share price drops. And they've got enormous legal fees that have to be paid. Yeah, it's a big bank, sure, and they'll just say, well, we just paid it and took care of it and so forth. And just like we had this attorney here yesterday talking about that person with a W. But it's important to understand the Swiss citizens and the shareholders of UBS really took a hit, but yet all the bankers walk away. Why? So it's such a magnitude problem here with UBS, and I think that's the arrogance that I'm trying to get at.
Right. Well, I think one thing that they did do with UBS that it would have been nice to do with Credit Suisse, so hats off. And it was the first out of the box, so again, credit to the government for that, was they did get names. They didn't get all the names, but they got names, which turns out to not be quite the an easy pie activity. But tell us about HSBC and how you see that.
Well, again, I think what Brad's saying is right. I mean, this is a systemic issue. I mean, with HSBC, you've got to imagine, this is one of the biggest, I think it's the second biggest commercial bank in the world. It's an iconic bank for Britain. And you only have to look at the people that were involved in this. I mean, the head of the bank, by the time this material, Falciani's material, was handed over to the British Tax Office, one of the people who was sitting in the government was the head of the bank. I mean, the guy had just gone basically from the bank into government. And a lot of the donors for the various political parties over there are people that had basically had accounts at HSBC. And so, of course, this is hugely politically, potentially embarrassing for the British government. One of the other big issues that came out of this, and which actually might change now in the upcoming election in Britain, is the use of what was called non-doms. So this is a scam, basically, in Britain, where you can live in Britain and own property and other things, but not actually pay taxes there because you're what's known as a non-domicile resident, including, by the way, the head of the bank, who was basically, for tax purposes, living in Hong Kong. And in the HSBC files, we found a Panamanian company that was basically the front for him, for the head of the bank. It was kind of crazy. So it's like when you're looking at this, it's the system all the way through is basically broken.
Thanks. I'm going to ask Brad one last question to touch on, but then I think we'll have just a few minutes left. If anyone has any questions, we're happy to take those as well, too. But just to give you a chance to think of your questions, Brad, give folks a sense. I know not just about you, but I know you're talking and dealing with a lot of other whistleblowers now, kind of in your new work and role. But talk about the emotional toll and kind of the story behind the story, what it's like, and how whistleblowers view the world.
Well, I think Hervé's a perfect example. I mean, here he's sitting here in a certain location, sending us on Skype or whatever it is, and quite frankly, you could hear in his voice some of the problems he had. He's under arrest in Switzerland. They're going to attack him for this. Now, maybe he did commit a crime, but he exposed a much bigger crime. So, is that a problem? Well, we can argue that. So I think that's one example. And he's running around and trying to duck and dodge and do the right thing, and some people be critical of him. So I think whistleblowers face a lot of uphill battles. You're going to be lambasted, you're going to be blackballed, you're probably never going to work again. Certainly if Dean wasn't so successful, certainly I wasn't going to go look for a job. But now I turn that around and then try to help whistleblowers again. I've been helping a few, one famous one, Robert McLean, out in California, the TSA air marshal. Quite frankly, the TSA just lambasted him and fired him. He went to the Supreme Court and won 7-2 ruling. I think you should all go look at that case. It's quite compelling. I mean, they destroyed this man. And I sent him money. I was happy to do it. Why? Because his daughter had a heart surgery. His wife was crying. He was unemployed. I mean, this is just unbelievable, the fact that the government does this to their own people. So forget about a Swiss bank. I mean, I went toe-to-toe with them. I don't mind, and I'll continue to go toe-to-toe with them. And I think it's important to understand that if you have the determination and you have the resourcefulness, as I did, and thank goodness I did, is that look at the success that I've caused. And some people would say this is monumental, unprecedented. And I would say it is, because what you're seeing now is the effects of monies coming back and hopefully some of these real serious problems. Forget the tax issue, but the illegal issues that are out there. So whistleblowers are always going to face an uphill battle, and I think we have to turn that tide of blackballing them and pushing them down on the scale.
Thanks for that, Brad. Well, like I said, we can take any questions or we can head you to the bar. Sir, go ahead.
Rod, who do you want to play you in the movie?
Dean's going to play me.
Yeah.
No. I am writing a book at this time, and I think it's important to write a book. Certainly, I think it's important to tell the story for others. A lot of people in the media have got the story wrong. A lot of people were critical of me. Some people were very good to me. So I think what I'm trying to do is clear the air. And certainly sitting here, hopefully it's educated some of you folks, and certainly I'm welcome to answer any questions and to go from there.
Isn't it your hope it's Ed Harris, but your fear is it'll be Drew Carey?
Bruce Jenner?
That's
Oh, no.
Oh, yeah, thank you. I have a couple of questions and a comment. You were mentioning with UBS the other factors, not only tax evasion, no? I mean, anti-money laundering, terrorist financing. And that's something that has been clearly detected with HSBC. And they got a sanction for 1.9 billion. So why do you think it didn't happen with UBS, if it's so clear? And my other question is, how much do you think your case and Falciari's case has incentivized the number of whistleblowers out there? And what is your sense of how many people are out there? And finally, because something that Gerard mentioned, and I think is very interesting, is that there's an incentive now for self-declaring and self-incriminating. And I think one of the incentives, too, is the fact that these people don't want to be extradited to the United States. So.
If I could ask them to put on the screen one of the documents I brought, if you can put that up on the overhead to answer that question. What happened, in essence, was that there was a lot more illegal and illicit activity that went on. Here's the document here, and I've got a pointer here to hopefully shoot at it here. Now, what you're seeing here, this is the gentleman's name. This was given to the Department of Justice on this date. There are my initials. That's on June 19th, 07. These are all the numbered accounts this gentleman had. Now, you might say, well, geez, you didn't give up names to the Department of Justice. I didn't, but I was allowed to give up this one. Why? Because he was involved in terrorist financing. And I gave this directly to the Department of Justice, Kevin Downing, and I walked him through why this client was so important. He was making illegal oil sales with Saddam Hussein. I read the whole file in the bank. My boss, his banker, talked everything about this client. And if you read it closely, you can see he's got a code word here. He's got an address here in New York, the 46th and 47th floor, the entire floor of the Olympic Tower, $50 million condo. He's got all these numbered accounts. He's got a password here. He's got a safe deposit box here. His daughter's the power of attorney on it. I knew everything about this client. But when I told him he was a good friend with Rudy Giuliani, he put his hand in his face and told me, we're not interested in non-Americans. I said, really? But you don't understand. He said, we're not interested. At that time, Rudy Giuliani was the front runner for the presidential campaign. So I take it very personally about this card, this piece of information I gave the Department of Justice, Kevin Downing, who committed treason, in my opinion, because nothing was done with this. So we can all sit here and talk about things, but this is so important. Now, if you're not going to follow up on this one, who was $420 million account, so that's the first thing. On other whistleblowers, what have I done? Well, I think, Dean, you might be able to respond to that.
So I think it's had a huge impact. I mean, I mentioned that already, but I think that, I mean, the law itself brought forward, I think, an initial rush of folks involved, Brad itself, but I think then the payments has brought out a second rush of folks that are more, I think, valuable to the IRS in that they're more knowledgeable, they're detailed, they're more senior, they're providing better information and what have you. So I think it's had quite an impact on that. But then, why don't we get your question in there too?
Oh, the self-declaring. I actually have an issue with the self-declaring because what's happening now is that people are coming forward and basically admitting to these accounts. The problem we saw with the Falciani stuff is that what the British Tax Office in particular were doing, where they were just tapping people that they saw on the list and said, hey, do you have an account? And then they were able to pay a fine and everything went away. I mean, if that was an ordinary citizen, they would have been prosecuted and they probably would have gone to jail. So you can see it from the tax office's point of view. They're saying, this is great, we're getting easy money, we don't have to go through court, we don't have to go through the whole problem of litigation. But so there is a basic injustice here in that people are able to get away with doing wrong that the average person would not be allowed to get away with, and just pay a simple fine and away. Because we were always curious as to why the British Tax Office in particular had not prosecuted anybody. I think they have one prosecution, even though we saw thousands of names and clear evidence of wrongdoing.
And to add to that, all the names I gave to the Department of Justice, not one person was prosecuted. Why? So you don't want to give me credit as the whistleblower, but giving those names, especially this one? Really? Mm-hmm. So maybe we should go talk to the 4,000 families that had their loved ones murdered in Iraq because they fought for this country. How about those people? You think they're interested in this guy?
Just to clarify, DOJ has not said they're not finish prosecuting the folks that you
It's 8 years later, I don't
Well,
know. It's, you know.
Maybe
we'll get around to it, what, in 2020, or-
The wheels turn slow. I would say one thing, and I think you raise a good point, Gerard, though, but I think the difficulty is, I don't know Inland Revenue as well as you do, but for the service, they suffer from, for them to suddenly say, I'm going to examine and put through the grinder 19,000 folks. I mean, that would just, so for them, it's kind of, how can we spook the herd, get everybody to start coming in? You're right, and it's kind of easy money. And then I think, and hopefully, and I think they're trying to do this, of saying, let's at least pick out some of the badder actors and haul them up and make an example of them. Where's our host, Mr. Marchand? I don't know if we have any other questions or have time for it, if we want to get people going. Any last questions?
Thank you.
Oh.
Brad, hi. You mentioned that there were several countries.
I'm looking for, where's the question being asked, sorry?
Right there,
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right.
1 o'clock.
You mentioned that there were several countries to whom you gave the information that didn't actually use that information. Can you kind of expound and name some of them?
Certainly. No, I'd be happy to. I was shocked at Germany, for instance, that I sat with German officials and gave them information and felt as though that, a lot of governments want to just get the check and walk away and call it a day. But that's not really justice. Anybody can write a check. So that was one instance. I'm in constant negotiations with the French magistrates in Paris to help them against UBS. And that's important because I have direct contact with the French team when I was in Geneva and what they did in Paris, in the French market, for that matter. Canada is a total debacle. I mean, they're pulling actually what Gerard has done in the UK, nothing. I mean, they're probably smoking too much hash up there or something, but
You were never going to get any Molson.
yeah, I know. But Canada, I gave this to them on a platinum platter. And quite frankly, what more do you have to do? You're giving it to law enforcement and you're giving them such explicit details, names, dates, places, and so forth, and numbers. I have PowerPoint presentations and so forth. Nothing's done. This is what really grinds people's gears, that if justice isn't pursued, then people say, well, geez, why does it apply to me then? So
I think it's catch as catch can. Speaking beyond just Brad, we get clients that are beyond that. For instance, we've had some very good experiences with the Germans as well. I know you had a bad journey with them, Brad, but it's up and down. And really, George, kind of goes to the media. I find that life goes a lot better when the media says, well, now there's 500 names here. Why are you not doing anything, Prime Minister? And suddenly the doors begin to open, and you probably have a better feel for that than I do.
Yeah, I think it's amazing that, after when did Falciani gave the material in 2008? I think he stole it in 2007. And it's only been since we published the stories that we're starting to see the likes of Nina Ricci's granddaughter being hauled before court and being prosecuted. I think there are 60 prosecutions now pending in France. And I just read a few days ago that there are 120 now pending in India. Why has it taken so long to happen?
It does. I think and for folks to deal with it, just even the whistleblower law that we wrote, folks didn't go quietly in the night. I think it's going to take just a real cultural change for a lot of countries to say, yes, we're going to treat this differently. We're going to welcome whistleblowers. We're going to welcome, going after this, using the information. You're right, it doesn't happen overnight, but I think it's a good example where the media matters hugely, because otherwise everyone can get very comfortable without doing much of anything.
Just to add to that, two parts. Number one, the fact that the French government was given this information on India, and they passed it over to India, and call it a quid pro quo, the Indian government had a deal to buy French fighter jets. So, geez, there was a little touch and feely there. And then, of course, there was a quiet amnesty program for the top, richest Indian clients. Why? That was kept secret. I know my friends because they work at HSBC, and I met with them in Paris, and they told me. So, quite frankly, that's a problem. That's a big problem.
Well, they got to pay for the jet somehow, so they can get the money. Any last questions, David? I can't really see anything. Are we done here? Do you got any last questions, or we're?
Have any questions? Any more?
I just feel like I've got two trucks coming at me, so I can't really see anything. Okay, great. Well, thank you all very, very much, and appreciate your time and all your efforts. And thank you, David, for being our good host.
So thank you all for coming. I greatly appreciate every dollar that everyone spends at this event. Our next event is in London on November the 23rd and the 24th of this year. Our next event at this venue is May the 1st to the 3rd of next year. So have a safe journey home. And for those who are staying at Cinco de Mayo this evening, and that's normally a very rowdy time on South Beach. Thank you very much.
Thank you.